At the dawn of Christianity, in the 4th year after the ascension of Christ, Peter, the Prince of the Apostles, founded the first Christian church here in Antioch, modern-day Antakya. The first patriarchal seat of the Syrian Orthodox Church, directly descended from Peter's church, was therefore also in Antioch, where it remained until the year 518. The seat of the church was then moved to various monasteries of Mesopotamia. The last was Deir Zafiran, which remained the official seat of the Patriarchate for nearly 700 years, from 1293 until 1932. After a period of atrocious violence, particularly during and following World War I, in which 250,000 faithful lost their lives, the Patriarchate was transferred to various places in Syria. Since 1957, it has been in Damascus. Today, the spiritual head of the Syrian Orthodox Church continues to carry out his high apostolic mission from the capital of Syria. Near the gate of Bab Tuma, one of the 7 gates in the ancient walls of Damascus, is the seat of the Patriarchate. The current Patriarch, His Holiness Moran Mor Ignatius Zaka I, is 122nd in a line that starts with St. Peter. A half-hour drive north of Damascus is the great Seminary of St. Ephraim, whose impressive buildings were officially opened in 1966. Although the style is modern, this and other recent church buildings often contain elements inspired by traditional Syriac architecture and style. One example of this is the new monastery of St. Mary near Hasake in eastern Syria. It has only recently been finished. A spontaneous act of reverence by a passing van driver honored the sanctity of this new monastery that was still not inaugurated at the time. The language of the Syrian Orthodox Church is Syriac. Along with Palmyrene, Nabatean, Mandaic, and the Jewish Aramaic dialects, Syriac is the legacy of Aramaic, the language of Jesus and the Apostles. A legacy that is cherished in these manuscripts of the past, some of which have had a hazardous and troubled history. So much so that it's a sheer miracle that a part of these, some of them 15 centuries old, have reached our own times. In 1559, a large number of Syriac manuscripts were burned in India in the presence of the members of the Jumper Synod, a move that aimed to stamp out many of the local Syriac Christian traditions. 10,000 Middle Eastern manuscripts were lost in 1715 when the ship that was carrying them to the Vatican sank. Perhaps these are among the reasons why, in the Syrian Orthodox Church of today, patient hands continue to copy these precious writings, the painstaking labor of a scribe from ages past. It took more than 340 hours to copy the Peshitta, the Syriac text of the Bible. A veritable labor of love. Here in the cave church of St. Peter in Antioch, the final liturgical ceremony of a synod of Syrian Orthodox bishops is being held. The synod is attended by the Patriarch and the archbishops and metropolitans of the 27 dioceses into which the church is divided. In turn, the dioceses gather together some 5 million faithful scattered throughout the Middle East, India, and the rest of the world as a result of the diaspora that has taken place, due above all to the need to escape from fanaticism and oppression in several of the home countries. When the solemn ceremony is over, the Patriarch and the bishops receive the respects of Christians who have come from all over the world to attend this rare event. Visitors include a group that perform folk dances from the host country. A garden of 500,000 palm trees and the imposing vestiges of what was once a large Roman city in the middle of the desert are the most remarkable characteristics of Palmyra, the ancient Tadmor in the heart of Syria, another hub of the Aramaic linguistic area. As in Petra, traces of the Aramaic idiom that used to be spoken here can still be found. The extraordinary story of this city features, among others, Zenobia, Queen of Palmyra, one of the greatest women of ancient times. Beautiful, noble, ambitious, a charismatic leader, and an indefatigable horsewoman, Zenobia addressed her people in Aramaic, wearing a helmet and purple robes. For a short period, the armies of Palmyra even managed to seize control of many of the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. This was in the day of the Emperor Aurelian, who eventually managed to capture Palmyra and take Queen Zenobia prisoner. Since very early times, the oasis was inhabited by the Aramaeans, and here people spoke Aramaic of Palmyra. Traces of that language can be seen on the Roman colonnade along the main road. Beneath the inscriptions in Greek are the same words in Aramaic.
قبورة دنه عبد بالحزاي بر بريكي بر بالحزاي.
Today, in the local museum, the voice of a scholar reading those Aramaic inscriptions as though they were a current idiom gives the impression of being caught in a time warp.
لعلمة بيرح نيسان سنة
Hatra in Iraq was founded in the 1st century BC and was destroyed by the Persians early in the 3rd century AD. More than 300 Aramaic inscriptions have been found here, some in the Aramaic dialect of Hatra. Many are of great historical importance. Most of these inscriptions are now preserved in the Museum of Mosul and in Baghdad, together with statues and other relics found at the site. By the second half of the 5th century BC, Aramaic had become the most widespread language in Palestine, as everyday documents inscribed on pottery indicate. In 1947, at Qumran on the shores of the Dead Sea, a Bedouin boy looking for a goat that had wandered off entered a cave untouched by time and stumbled upon what is probably the most important archaeological find ever made in the Holy Land: a terracotta jar containing the oldest group of scrolls ever discovered of biblical and non-biblical manuscripts. It was the first of a series of such scrolls that subsequently came to light in 11 caves, an unprecedented treasure that continues to fire the imagination and polarize the interest of scholars around the world. One of the first and best preserved of the scrolls contained the book of Isaiah, copied many centuries earlier than any other surviving manuscript of this book. The Isaiah scroll is written in Hebrew, but another one contains an Aramaic translation of the book of Job. From the Jordan to the Dead Sea, from Judea to Galilee to Samaria, from Syria to the Negev to Sinai, Aramaic was the language of the people, and therefore also the language of Jesus and the apostles. When he addressed the multitude in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus spoke in Aramaic.
بريخين ايلين ادمسكينين ونبروح ادلهوني ملكوث ودشمايو بريخين نون ايلين دابلين دهينون نثبايون بريخين ايلين ادماكي خين دهينون نرثون لرعو.
After the death and resurrection of Jesus, the apostles and disciples who constituted the Church of Jerusalem went out into the world to spread the word of God, speaking the only language that they knew well, Aramaic.
So they left and preached everywhere, while the Lord went with them and confirmed the word with his great works.
Antioch, Today Antakya, on the Orontes River, was the capital of the Roman province of Syria and the third most important city of the empire after Rome and Alexandria. No wonder that it was one of the first places visited by the messengers of the new religion. After consolidating his role as leader of the apostles, Peter lived there for a year with Paul and Barnabas, and together they gathered many converts. The inhabitants of Antioch were sometimes skeptical and often hostile. But here the church accepted non-Jewish converts, and for the first time its congregation became known as Christians. The echo of those days seems to permeate the air around the ancient church cave on the outskirts of the city, where it's believed that Peter preached when he was in Antioch with Paul. The Crusaders added the facade at a time when Antioch was an important Christian base in Syria, but the cave still looks as it did in its primitive state. Originally, it was owned by the evangelist Luke, a native of Antioch, who gave it to the Christians so that they could have their own place to meet and pray together. Today, it's impossible for Christians not to be overwhelmed by the emotion of being in a place that has been sacred since the dawning of their religion. For many tourists, the main attraction is the passage dug from the rock and used, according to tradition, to lead the faithful to safety in times of danger through a maze of inaccessible, overhanging caves. The cave church of St. Peter is still used. Pilgrims come here now and then to attend the solemn rites, unchanged by time, celebrated on special days, like the visit of the Patriarch to Antioch at the beginning of the 3rd millennium. For the most part, these pilgrims come from abroad, insofar as the local Christian community is now, unfortunately, almost non-existent.
حزيت الشفيو دلوم الدلح وابدا خيوتو روزو رابو فغرد موران ضم صالالو بلو فولوهو حزيت القشتو دلوم تفالخ ريخ قدامي ملكوثو دشمايو مردونيتو.
These Aleppo school children are reciting one of St. Ephraim's poems. It is as though their voices have crossed the border into Turkey, traveling to their ancestral home of Nisibin in search of the memory of Mor Ephraim the Syrian. Mor in Aramaic means Lord, Monsignor, or Saint. Until a short time ago, here in Nisibin, known today as Nusaybin, an inscription was to be found on the walls of this church, recording the date 359 AD, which means that St. Ephraim himself might have seen it being built, since he was still living in Nisibin at the time. We searched for the inscription in vain in the church dedicated to St. Jacob of Nisibin, another great Syriac saint that welcomed us in the empty silence of its splendid desolation. In Aleppo's new cathedral, one of the countless Syrian Orthodox churches dedicated to St. Ephraim, The remarkable modern frescoes are influenced by the rich Syriac culture, whose greatest figures were Bardaisan, known as the Aramaean philosopher, who died in 222 AD, the poets Balai, Narsai, and Jacob of Seruj, along with authors such as John the Solitary, Philoxenus of Mabuch, Sergius of Rishaina, and John of Ephesus, all belonging to the 5th and 6th centuries, followed in the 7th century by such men as Severus Sebokht, Jacob of Edessa, and Isaac of Nineveh, or Isaac the Syrian. These were followed in later centuries by great scholars such as Mushe bar Kifo, Dionysius bar Salibi, the patriarch Michael the Great, and culminating in the polymath Gregorius bar Ebroio in the 13th century. Included among these illustrious figures, naturally, is Saint Ephraim. Late antiquity, especially from the 3rd to the 5th centuries, was a period of hermits, ascetics, and monks. The remote, often inaccessible places that these mad followers of God inhabited seem impossibly inhospitable to us in the 21st century. These men cut themselves off intentionally from the rest of the world, and the only way to find traces of them is by following goat tracks. This is Wadi Kadisha, the Lebanese Holy Valley, where there are many remains of Syriac monasteries and hermit dwellings that blossomed during that age of great mystical fervor. However, these men, who were commonly referred to as the recluses, did not embrace a life of extreme sacrifice out of an abstract love of God, an elitist need for isolation, or an egotistical life of contemplation.